Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Understanding COVID-19 and vaccines and the virus and testing has been one of the things that we spent a fair amount of time on. We've had a great show on ventilation. We've had 2 shows on testing. We've had numerous shows on clinical trials. And today we're going to talk about self-administered home testing with a gentleman, Dr. Ioannis Prassas, who is a staff scientist at Mount Sinai Health Systems in Toronto. He's a scientist in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at Mount Sinai, system and researcher with laboratory of the Ethosorius P. Diametis Advanced Center for Detection of Cancer. I really probably pronounced that wrong. I apologize. His areas of interest include cancer research, drug development, high throughput screening, robotics, both molecular biology techniques, genomics, proteomics, biomarkers discovery, and bioinformatics. Dr. Prassas, welcome to our program. How are you?
I'm very good, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this very timely topic, which is the emergence of the rapid antigen tests for COVID-19 detection.
So tell me, where are you and what is the test and how is it different than what we're doing today?
So the major difference is where the test is taking place. So far we have this idea that if you want to get tested for COVID-19, you have to go to a hospital or a designated medical center that provides these tests. And then you give the sample, you wait for 2-3 days in order to get your results back. However, this paradigm shift that we see in the testing technologies now through rapid antigen tests is that everybody will have these tests in their houses and they can do it at their leisure, meaning that every time they want to get tested, they can do it in their houses.
And you say antigen, so what is it that you're testing?
So far, the classic molecular diagnostic test, which is called PCR, it is going after the nucleic acids, which is like the RNA of this virus. Now, these antigen tests are going after certain proteins, the structural parts of the virus that we can see it in just by using a nasal swab or even saliva.
So far, I understand most of the tests are nasal swabs. Only a couple of people are trying to currently get the saliva tests approved and validated. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. So saliva, even though it sounds, and it is, in terms of compliance and in terms of ease to use, it is a much preferred sample. However, the concentration of the viral antigens, the actual concentration of the viral proteins in saliva is way less compared to nasopharyngeal swabs. That's why if you end up going with the development of a saliva-based test, you will need ultra sensitive assays, which is not an easy task.
What are ultra-sensitive assays?
What are ultra-sensitive assays? So that's a great discussion. So we now understand much better what is the natural history of the virus once it enters the human body. So we know, for example, that in the beginning, once we get infected, we have a small amount of viral load in our lungs, and then this load has become bigger and bigger after 2-3 days, and then slowly again it fades away after a few days. So the classic PCR, the classic gold standard method that we have now for the diagnosis of COVID, it can detect as low as about 100 copies of the RNA in 1 ml of sample. Now, the tests that we want to introduce, they can see up to close to 100 times less, 100 times more antigen. So they're 100 times less sensitive. But what is really important here is that it does not mean that always the more sensitive the assay, the better it is. It all depends on what is the application of the test that you want to introduce. For example, if your question is, I want to identify who is now contagious, you really do not need to go so deep that a PCR technology can go. You do not need this extra sensitivity. The people that are contagious, we now know that they have high amounts of viral load that could easily be picked even by less sensitive technologies, similar to the rapid antigen tests that are coming up.
Okay, and the rapid antigen test that you're developing, describe it. Is it very similar to the nasal swabs we're doing today?
Yes, actually it is very similar. So how this would work, you would just need a cotton tip, a cotton swab. You insert it into your nose, about 1 inch into its nostril, and then you drop the tip into a solution, and then you allow it for some time in the solution, and then it's similar to a pregnancy test. You just put some drops into a paper-based strip, and then you detect. If there is 2 lines, you can say that you are positive. If you see 1 line, just the control, you just say that you don't have the disease. So it is very similar to what is a chlorine test in your pool, or similar to a pregnancy test that we do typically at home.
So you're taking a cotton swab, you're putting it in your nose, you're taking a sample, you're putting it in a solution, and then what? You're dropping the solution after a couple of minutes on a paper strip?
Yes, and then you allow for some time, and then the solution, just through a capillary force, will go through what we call a lateral flow procedure, and then you will see if there is 1 or 2 bands, depending on if you have the virus or not.
Well, it sounds like a fantastic innovation. I hope you get approved. We're going to take a break and come back more with the doctor and understand this in greater detail in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Dr. Ioannis Prassas, a staff scientist at Mount Sinai Health System in Toronto. He's in the pathology and laboratory medicine area, and he's working on a rapid test that you can do at home for COVID-19. Tell us, Dr. Prassas, what the status of your development is. This early stage, late stage? Tell us.
So we are still, our test is relatively at the early stages. However, there are several other companies, several other biotechs that have already walked these lines the last few months. And it's impressive, but even as back as February 2020, we had some biotechs from a group from Harvard that they developed, it's called E25 Bio, and they developed the very, very fast rapid antigen test. And since then, they are pushing the authorities to get approval. However, they are stuck into some policy making that was not really ready for this type of applications. So even though we don't have, as of today, any assay that is already approved for home-based testing, we see a big trend now. We have a few tests that are approved not for home-based testing, but for a lab-based or hospital-based testing. And there is a big pressure now to open up these tests even for home use. So my prediction is that and by the end of this year, beginning of 2021, we're going to see the emergence of these tests directly in the consumer houses.
Now, tell us what the stages of development that you have to go through. So you're obviously developing this now. Do you have to then get the test validated by some regulatory authority?
Yes. So there is different types of regulatory pathways that you can walk in order to get approval. Most of the companies now, they obtain what we call an emergency use authorization approval, which is under the extreme situations that now we encounter. They require somewhat less rigorous validation, but still you must provide a very convincing package regarding the analytical performance of your assay and how many samples you have tested it, what is the sensitivity, what is the specificity, what is the predictive value, and all this classic analytical performance that you must convince the authorities that your test satisfies before it gets approval.
You've used 2 words beginning with S, and I wonder if we can understand what the different words are. So you said sensitivity and specificity. Explain what the difference is between sensitivity and specificity, if you could.
That's a great question, and I get it's quite often even for our students in the lab. So sensitivity is when we say a test has 80% sensitivity, what does this mean? This means that the test will correctly manage to capture 80% of the people that indeed have the disease. So this is what sensitivity means. Specificity is the percent. If we say a test has now 90% specificity, it means that 9 out of the 10 people that do not have the disease will be negative for the test. So this is the difference. Sensitivity refers to capturing correctly those that have the disease, and specificity refers to sparing those that do not have the disease.
And what do you think your test will achieve versus what the PCR test achieves today?
You know, there are reports now for this rapid antigen test. We are not there yet for our test because we still need to optimize some of the parameters before we further increase our accuracy of our test. But it is impressive when I look at the rapid antigen tests that are already out there. They report specificities that exceed 99%, and typically they have a sensitivity which is between 90 to 95%. Having said that, of course, there will be false positives and false negatives, as is the case with any test. Even for the gold standard test that we use now, PCR, there are false positives and false negatives, which means if now someone goes to a hospital and gets a test, a PCR test, and the result is negative, this does not mean 100% that you do not have the disease. There is various reasons can lead to a false negative result. And for example, in the case of PCR, the confidence, what we call the negative predictive value, but simply put, the confidence of being negative would be about 80%, not 100%. For the test that we are using, the false positive and the false negative rate will be higher compared to PCR, but this will be completely compensated by the very frequent application of these tests, something that is not suitable with the expensive and laborious PCR technologies that are existing today. So sensitivity, which means the ability of the test to capture those that have the disease, is not always the only criteria that would make a test fit for purpose for what it is its intended use. Rapid antigen tests, because exactly they can be applied very, very frequently, they can afford way less sensitivity compared to classic PCR technologies.
So I had an interview with the CEO of the Oxford University Healthcare Network in the UK, and he was telling me that the PCR test is got a cost of around £25, and that he thought that a saliva test might be less than $1, and so therefore a 25 times less costly product, and that's before labor. And also obviously the PCR takes a fair amount of labor, and the saliva test or at-home rapid test may not take much labor at all. Does that make sense to you from an order of magnitude?
Yes, that sounds correct. Actually, there is this number, everyone is talking about this rapid antigen test, that the cost should remain under the $5. Yet, we have not seen these tests out there, with the exception of the Binax now from Abbott, which is at $5. There are some point of care antigen tests that start getting applied in different settings. For example, in airports, we see it. In some nursing houses, we have some trials. The actual cost that is reported is slightly higher. We're between $5 to $20, but eventually the goal is to go even below the $5 and go closer to the $1-2 per test. So this would provide a much better margin for doing these tests very frequently.
No question, and would allow a situation where you could test everyone coming into work every day. You could test everyone going into a library every day.
Yes, even though I will need now, in the beginning there was quite a bit of turbulence when it came to getting approval for these rapid antigen tests. The road was not always open. So I still remember that up until June, the Health Canada and FDA were completely, I would say, negative with the idea of a screening test like this, just because they did not know exactly. We also did not have the data to prove what is the exact niche in terms of the application that these tests can have. Now we have all the models in place, and all the modeling shows that, especially in areas that there is an outbreak, we can throw all these rapid antigen tests into these areas, and this can make a big difference in stopping the transmission chains and keeping the virus transmission intact. So I think that there is very little doubt now that these tests can make a difference. It is just a matter of really fine-tuning what is the appropriate conditions for these rapid antigen tests to be applied. You mentioned before, Brian, that we may use this every day. As of today, the data show that twice per week use of these tests should suffice, and based on the current outbreak rhythms that we have in different places, and we do not need to do even more frequent than that. So soon we're going to have these calculators. I know that it is coming now. A similar calculator is going to be published in the next couple of weeks in New England Journal of Medicine, that is going to illustrate exactly this. What are the conditions, and based on these conditions, how many rapid antigen tests should population use in order to maximize its utility? So we are going there, we have the data, and the authorities follow this data. That's why their language has already changed, and we have been from a very distant and negative policy. Now the language is much smoother, and already it's almost welcoming the new trend, which is the rapid antigen tests.
How long does it take you to get the result?
Less than 15 minutes.
So, you know, I went to a dentist last week. I went to the hospital last week. I went to a couple of other places. Every single time I spent, you know, maybe 2 minutes answering a whole list of questions. And some places I actually had to get an online form that I had to go through a whole list of questions and fill out answers. And the answers were, you know, did I have a fever? Did I have a cough? Did I have any symptoms? Had I traveled outside of the country? Had I been, so, you know, if we're going to do that anyway, why not just test everybody?
Exactly. I think that a 10-15 minute, it is permitting this, it's an okay time that this can be adopted by many institutions, including schools, nursery homes, centers, malls, especially in areas and in times when there is an outbreak. Because an important thing maybe for the audience to highlight would be that how reliable these tests are, it also depends not only on the analytical properties of the test, which is our work, but it also depends on how big is the incidence of the disease in the population. If the disease is extremely low, even if you have a near perfect test, this would result inevitably to many false positives just because the disease is extremely rare. But when the disease becomes much more common, let's say we go from 1% of the population to 10% incidence, what we call prevalence of the disease, then the value of this test immediately becomes extremely high.
I don't understand that. So why would you have a far greater amount of false positives when the incidence of the virus in the population is 1% versus 10%?
Yes, because this is what we call, now I would try to explain it without becoming too technical. This is what we call positive predictive value. So in a way, what the positive predictive value says is that if I get a result that it is positive, what are the chances that indeed I have the disease? And this thing, it depends on two things. It depends on how good my test is in detecting the disease, but it also depends on how frequent is this disease in the population. Because if the disease is extremely rare, the default, let's say, is that you will not have it. So most of the times, all of the test is expected before the test to be negative. I know it is a bit counterintuitive, but the tricky thing with the predictive value is that we need, it takes into consideration not only the analytical performance of the test, but also how spread the disease in the population is. And that's why the same problem applies to, for example, the serological tests that were approved back in May. And there was a big discussion out there about their reliability, again, for the same reason. If the prevalence of the disease in the population is very low, a positive serological test may very well be a false positive. And if you want to give you some numbers, if the disease is as low as less than 1% in the population, then for every one true positive that these tests get, you may get as high as 90 false positives. So this is very tricky. This applies to all screening diagnostic applications. So we have to separate screening and diagnosis. Screening refers to asymptomatic people that we go to normal, healthy-looking people and we try to see if they have the disease or not. Diagnosis refers to people that they have some symptoms, they go to their doctor, and the doctor prescribes them this specific test to find out what is the cause of the symptoms. The screening application, it is very well dependent on the prevalence, on the incidence of the disease. That's why screening biomarkers and screening tests in general are very difficult to develop. Even some of the most pronounced tests that we have, for example, mammography for breast cancer or PSA for prostate cancer, they are not seen favorably for screening just because they depend on the prevalence of this disease in the general population that reduces their predictive value.
If that's true, and I guess it intuitively sounds like it makes sense because, if you've got the prevalence of the disease is 80%, the chance of getting a false positive is very low because 80% of the people are going to have it anyway. But the reciprocal of that must be a concern, that if the prevalence is low, the chance of a false negative should be very high. And so therefore, isn't the chance that we're missing people that are in fact have the disease?
When the prevalence is very low, you have higher chances that you will get a false positive, because the a priori, the most, let's say, default situation is that you will not have it, correct? So if we go in areas of very high incidence, then you have a problem of false negatives, because the default there would be that you will have the disease.
Okay, sounds like it's going to be a challenge. When do you think your product is going to be approved for commercial use?
Well, as I say, our lab in general is not really focusing only on this point of care device. Our major focus, we are a proteomics lab, and what we try to do in general is that a piece of information that is really missing from the understanding that we have of this disease so far is we don't know what is the big picture of the immunological responses that people have to this virus. For example, everybody now tries to understand, do we have this one antibody raised against this virus? Do I have this specific response to this virus? But the big immunological picture is not completely clear yet. Our lab is what is trying to do. We are trying to analyze in the blood of the people along the course of the disease the full picture of all the immunological responses against the different viruses and how these change kinetically over the course of the disease. So our rapid antigen test angle, it is something that we do not exclusively invest our resources into. It's something that we just illustrate that this can happen relatively easy, but I think that the time plan in general for rapid antigen tests is by the end of the year, there should be a lot of rapid antigen tests available for commercial end user applications.
We're chatting tonight with Dr. Ioannis Prassas, staff scientist at Mount Sinai Health System, who's working on a lot of stuff. One of them is a rapid home test. Maybe I'll come back after the message break and ask him about some of these other things that he's just touched on in regards to the impact of the virus over time, which sounds kind of interesting. Stay with us. Well, we're back. We're having an interesting conversation. At least I think we're having an interesting conversation with Dr. Ioannis Prassas, who is a staff scientist at Mount Sinai. He works in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, Mount Sinai. He's a researcher. He specializes in drug development, high-throughput screening, robotics, molecular biology techniques, genomics, proteomics, biomarkers, and bioinformatics. Sounds like a pretty smart guy. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. Doctor, we've talked about this home test, home rapid test, and you say it's not the only thing that your laboratory is working on, and that what you're doing is you're trying to understand the infection over time and its impact. And so I've had a couple different people that I've interviewed that have suggested that we've overly focused potentially on the respiratory impacts, and that's clearly one of the biggest impacts and most immediate, but that there's two other impacts that are needing more analysis and maybe having a longer term impact even with people that don't, the people that recover. And one is a vascular impact where it causes impacts on the vascular system, including blood clots, and then also a neurological impact where it's causing cognitive impacts. Is that true? And can you explain that if it is true? Or if it's not true, explain why it's not true.
Yes, actually, what you are referring, Brian, that's a great point. Let's think about how this virus enters the human body. So the receptor that this virus is looking for in order to grab it and enter our bodies is called the ACE2 receptor. Then it would make sense to ask, what are the different tissues in our bodies that express this receptor? Because in theory, once the virus gets into our system, all these tissues are then prone to the infection from this virus. And actually, this is what we see. You mentioned the endothelial damage, and we know that blood vessels express this receptor, and this is the beginning of what we see like a systemic inflammatory reaction in the endothelia, in the blood vessels, that is driving the formation of the clots that is very frequently seen in these patients. Similarly, we have the neural damage from the cells that do express the ACE2 receptors. And in general, we have the kidney damage, and what all the organs that express this receptor, they are susceptible to the damaging effects of SARS-CoV-2 infection. I want to make a step backwards though, Brian, and explain one thing that I think is a black box that we definitely need to shed more light on. So most of the people, when they see their kid being sick, or they say, oh, my kid got a cold. And I know that this word is almost annoying me anymore because this word hides a lot of very important information. We know, for example, that all the cold-like or flu-like symptoms are mostly triggered by when we by the encountering of certain viruses, let them be coronaviruses about 20% of the times, rhinoviruses up to 40% of the times, and some flu-like viruses, parainfluenzas or respiratory viruses, the remaining of the times. So what I think it's about time, and I think that because this pandemic has brought the viral immunology in the spotlight, we are going to finally develop these missing tools that we're going to provide much better granularity in defining what this "I got a cold" means. So I think that in the next, it's a couple of years, every time our kid comes back from home, we're going to be able to say, once he has a mucus or once he doesn't feel well, to do this test immediately and define what is the virus that he or she encountered. And what we are developing as a lab, we are developing now this technology that we allow, just by using some amounts of blood, to monitor all these immunological responses to the different viruses that we encounter. So imagine now that I take some of Brian's blood, and then I can tell you what are the different viruses that you have encountered before, and what is the stored memory of your immune system against which specific viruses. You can imagine that once we have this information, we will be much, much more prepared for a more precise management of the next pandemic, which is due to come, maybe not soon, hopefully, but these are the missing tools that now is the time to develop. And this is what we're working on.
So you're saying that you'll be able to take a sample of my blood and you'll be able to test it and you'll be able to tell me whether I've developed immunity to a common cold or to a flu or to a coronavirus?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the technology has now matured to a point that we can afford, even cost-wise. It's not like the rapid antigen test. This will not cost $1 or $2, but with a relatively small cost, we can foresee now how individuals would like to keep a record of their immunity and how this changes over time. And we believe that this information can be really fundamental in our understanding with what is the interplay between humans and different types of viruses, not only for this one, but in general with regards to all possible viruses that we have encountered in the past and that we will encounter in the future.
Okay, so how does that help me? If I know that I've encountered a cold or a flu virus in the past, people tell me I still have to take the flu vaccine every year because the flu mutates, and so I'm not immune to it. I've got to get a new immunity by getting a new vaccine. So how does what you're doing help me?
So that's a very good question. So first of all, not all viruses mutate at the same speed that influenza mutates. For example, we know that this SARS-CoV-2 virus mutates in way less speed compared to both the influenza virus and the HIV virus. But in the same time, when we see that your immunological profile, even if the virus mutates in a way, it does not mean that you will not have any protection against this virus. Let me put a scenario that will make the value proposition very clear. Now we have these vaccine trials, and then we start assigning to volunteers or to individuals the different vaccines, and we monitor how they behave when they finally encounter the virus of interest. But we do not really know what is their baseline immunity. Now we know, for example, that there is a lot of crosstalk between immunological responses to previous coronaviruses with this newer one. So how would we make a meaningful comparison between those that got the vaccine and those who did not, if we do not know that they all start from the same line with regards to the previous immunological responses that they have built up? So this is where I think that understanding at any single time, another application, we have a new pandemic, and then immediately we have to prioritize who is going to be the front line that is the more susceptible next to the other ones that are not. And we do see here that even within the same age bracket, some individuals are very susceptible, some are very medium susceptible, some are completely strong.
Okay, so this is interesting because this is something different than I've heard before. So, what we have been told is that people are far more susceptible as they age. And the sense is, I thought, was that because as they age, their immune system becomes weaker. What you're saying is that in addition, even people of the same age, and also that people that have got pre-existing conditions, they've got diabetes or they're obese or whatever, may be more susceptible. What you're saying is that two healthy people the same age may have a different susceptibility to get infected because of their exposure to different viruses in the past.
Yes, I think that what do you mean? We call it the COVID-19 in the case of this pandemic. Instead of the chronological age, we call it the COVID-19 age. And this age clock takes into consideration your actual chronological age, your other diseases that you may have. For example, if you have diabetes, if you're obese, and this adds, we have a certain metric that it adds some number to this COVID-19 age. And then if you also had your record of previous immunological buildup, this can reduce age from your final score. And you can imagine that, I know this sounds like a science fiction type of thing, but eventually this is how we may be able to rank people by susceptibility, by taking into consideration all these factors.
Okay, so these factors that potentially subtract would be what? That you've been exposed to a flu or to a cold or to some
for
other
example,
coronavirus or what?
We will know very soon. Already there are very strong evidence that exposure to previous coronaviruses, you create, for example, this T cell reaction. I'm not going to details, these immune cells that they have the memory, and then they can be useful even for this newer coronavirus from the previous encounter. So once we understand what are the real correlates of immunity from previous infections, then we need to know who has these correlates of immunity and subtract them from this COVID-19 age that I mentioned before.
Give us a sense of what some of these other coronaviruses are or have been.
Excuse me, can you repeat the question?
What are some of the coronaviruses that have existed prior to COVID-19?
Yeah, it is interesting when people, when they hear coronavirus, they have completely, when they hear coronavirus, they think it's only SARS-CoV-2, but this is not the case. There are hundreds, thousands actually of coronaviruses existing in nature out there. 4 of them are the major ones that have an interplay with humans, and the remaining 4, they create the classic common cold symptoms. Typically, these coronaviruses come in the late winter, early spring, and they account for about 20% of the common cold diseases that kids or individuals suffer in the early winter, early spring, mostly time. So these are in the same family. These are coronaviruses. They, for whatever reason, it's not the time now, they never had the capacity to create such a pandemic. But they do share a lot of functional elements, and there is cross-immunological memory from prior coronaviral exposures.
So if I have caught the common cold a bunch of times in the past, there's a good chance that I will have created some sort of increased immunity to coronavirus, to COVID-19?
We have to wait for the evidence to completely seal it, but this is what the evidence say now, that there is a strong chance that previous exposures can create a memory, neurological memory, even for SARS-CoV-2 response. Yes.
Really? That's fascinating. And so people think that we're going to be able to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, but I've always heard that there's no vaccine for the common cold. If we can create a vaccine for COVID-19, I guess what you're saying is we could actually create a vaccine for the common cold.
Well, we will see that too. It depends again on how, when we say there is cross reactivity, does not mean that it's completely masking the effects of all coronaviruses, but depending on what is the vaccine made against, sure, there may be efficacy against other similar type of viruses too. So the reason that we never had common cold, I think it's mostly financially. It wouldn't make sense. It's not like that they pose such a big threat that we would need to go and because vaccine is a very daunting task.
No question. With SARS that we had in 2003, a coronavirus.
Yes, Yes, the thing with SARS was, unfortunately, it's a killer virus. It would kill much more people than SARS-CoV-2, but because there were no asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic disease transmission, very few people got the disease. So from a population point of view, there is not a lot of immunological buildup against SARS-CoV-1, SARS virus, just because not many people got it.
We're having a fascinating chat tonight with Dr. Prassas from Mount Sinai Health Systems, and a researcher with the laboratory there, who's working #1 on a rapid at-home test that we can use to find out whether they have COVID-19, but also is spending a fair amount of time working on understanding how the infection impacts us over time. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments from the doctor in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As many of you that listen to my show probably know, I've been very interested, as probably all of us have been, in COVID-19 and what's going on. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing a bunch of infectious disease specialists, several people working on vaccines, several people working on tests, etc. Dr. Ioannis Prassas, a staff scientist at Mount Sinai Health System, has been my guest tonight, and we've talked about a rapid at-home test that is going to be a nasal swab that you're going to be able to put in a solution, and 15 minutes later you'll be able to figure out whether you got SARS, the COVID-19. But we've also talked about its impact on the respiratory system, the vascular system, the neurological system, and we've also talked about building up immunity over time. So, what a fascinating conversation. But doctor, even with all these conversations and so many people working on so many solutions and problems and tests and vaccines and whatnot, there are thousands of people downtown Toronto, downtown Montreal, downtown Ottawa, downtown London, England, etc., protesting, saying this is all a hoax. Is this a hoax?
Yeah, I know. I think that we should not be laughing at that. It's a huge problem, and obviously there are big reasons behind it, and all this questioning and all this skepticism. For me, especially, that I witnessed myself all these huge efforts that all the scientific community is doing in order to understand the virus and create the tools to save as many people as possible. It is quite shocking to see that even today people refuse the fact that there is a pandemic going on, there is a virus. Of course, there is a problem sometimes when there are huge statements from either side that create this sense that, this statement was never vindicated. So I think that we should leave the scientists do the work. Unfortunately, I don't believe that people that already don't believe in the existence of this virus, they will almost never be convinced unless they see it in their vicinity, in their neighborhood, or if they see that indeed it has impacted their own life. I say that there is room for optimism. There is an improvement in all fronts. There is improvements in the therapies. There is marginal but true. There are improvements in the diagnostic technologies, and there is much more things coming. And instead of putting too much emphasis on the skepticism, I would put my focus into all these big efforts that humans are doing in order to save the game. So yeah, it's a sad reality, but I don't know how to see an easy fix for this skepticism.
Okay, so you're a smart scientist. You've studied this infection and other infections before. If I put you up on stage in front of 20,000 people that were at a rally that were skeptical and asked you to state what you believe, what would you tell them?
I would say it's not what I believe, it's what the data says. There is a virus out there. This virus is extremely, it could be potentially very harmful for especially certain population groups. we know that. We know who these people are. We talk about mostly about the older and those that they have a secondary disease going on. But it is out there. It is not a science fiction. We still need to understand why in Bergamo, in Italy, this happened. In New York, this happened. We have more than 200,000 deaths in the United States already. Whole countries, we've seen this every day. I think that it is completely weird if you're still not believing that we are living a pandemic. Now, I think that scientists will do their best to convince them that in the next time the pandemic will come, we have less and less people being skeptical and more people investing their hopes in proper science and proper evidence in order to be ready to encounter this thing.
So you're obviously extremely knowledgeable in this area. When are we going to get back to normal? When are we going to have rapid stay-at-home tests? And when are we going to have a vaccine?
That's very difficult to answer. I think that in my mind, at least, the back to normalcy would be clearly having a vaccine in order to protect those that are either in the front line or that are especially vulnerable to this virus. And I think that in 2021, I'm not a vaccine expert, but from what I hear, we are not very far from the very first vaccines. It's a matter of a few months. So vaccine would be a first milestone. I think that rapid antigen tests would really find their niche in terms of allowing more and more freedom to people to start gaining some of their life back. I have full hope in these very brilliant minds that I'm not talking about our group, I'm talking about all the groups that are working into this thing. And for example, Michael Mina and the group from Harvard, they're doing an amazing job, not only for developing the technology, but trying to democratize this knowledge and explain to more and more people. We need people to understand the potential use of these rapid tests and push as much as they can there, using their own power to get these tests. These tests will not necessarily substitute masks or something, but is going to create another level of comfort, and more people would feel more at ease of doing more like normal like life activities. So we have to be patient. We have to be patient for those that are particularly vulnerable, and we're not that far. A year time in the big scheme of things is not that far.
Dr. Ioannis Prassas, a scientist in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at Mount Sinai Health System. Thank you very much for joining us and educating us on rapid testing, on COVID-19, on the different impacts in the vascular and neurological system, and a fascinating conversation about buildup of immunity over time. Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your interest.
Well, that's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for tonight. We're going to come back to you every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and videocasts after the fact on briancrombie.com. Thank you. Good night.